Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Matrix SCM webinar, and thank you all for sharing your lunch hour. Very grateful for that. My name is Richard Gelder. I'm the construction sector property lead here at Matrix SCM, and I'm delighted today to be joined by a panel. So firstly, we have Rob Walton. Rob is the Chief Operating Officer of Construction Line. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with Construction Line and the key role that they play in managing standards and regulations in the sector. We've also got Simon Gibbs. Simon is the chair of Matrix SCM, and he's got a wealth of experience both as the chief executive and also as a non-executive director to bring to today's discussion. And finally, we have Esther O'Callaghan, OBE. Esther is the founder of Hundo Careers, and Hundo specialises in working with employers to connect, attract and retain Generation Z talent. So we're just having a slight technical issue with Esther. We hope we will find her in a moment, but if not, we will be doing some ad-libbing, so bear with us on that. I'm just going to do a quick mic test, and Simon and Rob, can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. Wonderful. Okay, fantastic stuff. Okay, so look, a brief introduction first for those of you who do not know Matrix SCM. We're one of the UK's market leaders in managing and improving recruitment supply chains. We were described by one of our clients recently as right move for temporary recruitment, which was very nice of them. And we operate as a neutral vendor, managed service provider for agency workers. We're currently working in partnership with 100 UK businesses and organisations, and our aim is to reduce costs whilst making hiring reliable, simple and fast. Hopefully we'll bring a slide up in a moment, but in terms of our social value credentials, we've had a dedicated team within our business since 2018, and that's been led by my colleague Siobhan Goss. And social value is a really important area for us, so it's a real vested interest for us as a business. And what the team do is now a firmly established part of our proposition for how we support our clients in delivering their social value priorities. So the format for today's event is split into two halves, and for the first half you'll hear from myself and the panel. So I'm going to start with a big picture overview, providing the context to social value today. Rob will then pick up with an overview to new legislation and guidance, both from a supplier and a supply chain perspective. And then hopefully, all being well, we'll hear from Esther, and Esther will give us some practical context to our session and an overview of some of the work that she's leading on at Hundo. For the second half, we're going to switch to a Q&A format, which Simon will chair. We've had some questions, but more questions are welcome. And there is an icon at the top of the screen, and you can start posting those now, and we'll pick those up in the second half. Right, so let me start the session proper with the big picture overview. I'm going to try and provide some context to help frame our discussion today. So for me, the obvious start point is that social value is not a new issue. I would be amazed if there was anyone on today's webinar who hasn't been providing social value activities to their clients in recent years. And thinking back, and I was racking my brains before doing this webinar. My first piece of delivering social value, and not that we called it that at the time, of course, was a programme I did in the early 2000s with Amicus Horizon Housing Association. They're now Optivo Housing Association, where I led a job-seeking skills programme with their tenants. I did the programme very much as a value add to the recruitment work that I was doing with our asset management and repairs and maintenance team. And the business reasons I did it was because it not only strengthened my relationship, but it also helped to make the case when we tendered for the next contract. And the really important context to remember at that time, and I appreciate it was many years ago, was that the compulsory competitive tendering regime, or CCT as it was called at the time, had been replaced by best value. So it was the start of tendering that considered the bigger picture, not just cost alone. But back to today, and we've an update to the legislation and guidance around the 2012 Social Value Act, and that came into effect on the 1st of January this year. And we're going to hear from Rob on that shortly. And that's the challenge. We have to understand and navigate that new landscape. What is it we do differently? And as businesses, how do we deliver and measure social value going forward? And if I go back to the change that I referred to a few moments ago, when we moved from a compulsory competitive tendering or a CCT regime to a best value regime all those years ago, this feels very, very similar. There's an opportunity there to take a competitive advantage if you get it right, but there's also a threat if you don't. So a couple of slides to help context where we are, and hopefully you can see this on the screen now. And this is some data from a survey we did in June of this year. This is a survey from June of this year between Building Journal and Faithful and Gould and Atkins. You can see that on the screen. And the survey asked respondents from across the built environment for their insights around social value. So the key headlines from the survey you can see on the screen here, a combined 77% said they don't understand social value well enough. 65% said that their business didn't have a social value policy, and 80% currently don't have a tool to measure social value. So there is obviously a challenge in getting to grips with the changes, and that's possibly understandable because when they were announced, we were in the midst of the COVID crisis, and it was quite easy to lose track of what was going on. But there's both an understanding perspective looking at the survey data as well as the practical aspects as well. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a slightly different picture being painted here, and there's absolutely no surprise, but the construction sector has been doing social value for many years, and I suspect that most of you will be able to track your social value activities back as I had over many years. But this is a piece of research done by Scape, and this is also from June, and they looked at 1,400 construction projects over the last 7 years, so a fairly substantive piece of data, and they picked out the social value work that was delivered on them, and I just think it's a great summary of what the sector's doing. The key themes are there. You've got local employment, you've got local spend, there's training, but it's important to note the variety too, and there's different areas including the environmental and the wider community support initiatives as well. So I think we can say that the construction sector is actually pretty comfortable with social value, having delivered it in various guises in a fairly significant way for a number of years. The key question for me, though, and to try and frame, I think, what today's about, is do you need to take action following the change in legislation and guidance, or is it okay to carry on doing what you're doing? After all, if you've been delivering social value activities already, do you actually need to change anything? My personal view is absolutely yes, change is required. And some of you may be aware or may not, but there's been a training programme for 4,000 commissioners. So these are the public sector buyers of services that's been underway, and that's nearly completed. And we're already starting to see some change in some of the tenders coming out. So as a current example of that, here at Matrix SCM, we're working on a tender, and this is new. And there are 49 measures within the social value commitments part of the bid that are all articulated, and they've all got measurements against them. And this is very unlike tenders that we saw pre the 1st of January. So there does seem to be a big change happening. So if I go back to my earlier points, yes, we have a challenge to keep evolving and innovating around the social value work we deliver, but it's those headlines from Building Journal survey which are the key areas that I think we need to be thinking about. It's understanding the legislation and the guidance. It's thinking about how we respond with our policies and strategies. And then finally, from a measurement perspective, what does that look like and what do we do? So hopefully that's a bit of a sort of scene set, but before I pass over to Rob, let me just try and round up with some thoughts on the sort of actions that we need to take or that we need to consider as we shape our thinking around social value going forward. And my main thought in terms of framing the need for action is the point I made a couple of minutes ago. There is an opportunity there for us, but there is also a threat if we don't get it right. So I think, you know, there's a real sort of call to arms here. So given that, I think the start point for me is that probably at simple level, there's going to be more of us within our businesses that have to be involved with social value. So as I mentioned here at Matrix SCM, we have a dedicated team led by my colleague Siobhan, but with the change in legislation and guidance, it's now a bigger issue for us and will demand more time from our operational colleagues, our supply chain colleagues, and also our colleagues in the bid team. But aside of that, what do you need to do? What do you need to think about? And I've got 4 simple headlines, and I'm sort of posing these as a bit of food for thought as we go through the rest of the session today, but the things that you need to consider. So firstly, let's start with understanding, and I take it as a given you may already have your own expertise in place, but if not, I think the start point is learning about the Act and the new language involved. So there's new language that I'm learning, themes, model award criteria, these types of things, but it's also the landscape and the context too. And I think this is going to be the foundation to any plan or action that any of us take. So aside of events like today and the material we'll cover, personally, I found the gov.uk website particularly useful, and there's some great material on there. In September, when they launched the Procurement Policy Note 620, there was some fantastic documents with that, including stuff from the government commercial function around social value, and also the construction playbook, which followed in December. So secondly, taking stock, what do you do already? And there's a bit of a sort of MOT feel to this, but to give some context, within the Matrix business, Siobhan has led an exercise here to do that. So she's taken stock of what we do, and we launched our first social value report in the spring of this year. And that's helped us to define in detail all the activity that we've done over the last year. And it's really been an invaluable exercise. So before you take any action, it's probably the obvious thing to make time to sort of take stock and to recognise what you've been doing. I think it's throwing a blanket over that activity, whether it's big or small. And if you go back to that scape slide, there's lots of detail in there to what would qualify as social value. And the chances are, if you're a big organisation, if you have a regional structure, if you have a divisional structure, there's probably things happening within your business that you may not even be aware of. So really important job there. And again, it's really important to keep saying it's your direct activities, but it's also that of your supply chain too. So thirdly, developing your plan and approach going forward. So look, there's an awful lot in this, but one of the things, or one of the insights that I've picked up is understanding the priorities of your clients and really trying to make sense of which of those you can do, and indeed which of those you want to do, because by definition you can't do everything and you may not have the expertise to do so. And then that leads on to sort of who needs to be involved and who leads that at your business. So there is going to be a role here as a leadership piece, but there's also going to be a role, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, with people involved within the business in different teams who have to become more actively involved. And again, particularly how that then links into the supply chain. And fourth and finally, it's measurement. You know, what does that look like? I think this is a bit of an unknown, but it'll be really interesting as we go through the conversation just to get a bit of a sense of that. But, you know, can you do internally, or do you need to reach out for external expertise and support? And for most of us, this is going to be a brand new area by definition and is going to need time invested in. So there's lots to think about. I'm sure you already have your plans underway, but I hope that's been a good scene set and provides some useful food for thought. So Rob, can I hand over to you now to give an overview to the new legislation and guidance? Yep. Is that okay? And are you picking up loud and clear?
I am.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hopefully you can all hear me as well.
Yeah.
Excellent, cool. So certainly from our perspective at Construction Line, there's almost like the world before and after PPN 0620. Now, in 2012 or 2013, when it came into law, the Social Value Act was enacted into law and pulled out a couple of high-level extracts for all of these, you know, with the intention of improving the economic, social, and environmental well-being of the relevant area. Now, that mainly came through in people looking for suppliers local to the area of the project, potentially looking at things around apprenticeships and training. The amount of emphasis put on that was I wouldn't say was necessarily that significant. So we engaged a lot with our customer base over the last couple of years, largely driven by replatforming. And one of the things we were showing in the system that we could do geo-mapping of supplies, for example. People were like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool, because we spend a lot of time having to try and show where our suppliers are relevant, respective to projects and where spend is going. But you know, we kind of accept it's kind of the cost of doing business. Then PPN 0620 came along. And you know that, and it kind of took that Social Value Act from being, you know, a high level. So if you look at the Social Value Act 2012, it's literally like a one-page piece of legislation with some high-level guidance on what they should be doing from a public procurement perspective. PP 620 came along, and it gave some very explicit guidance on how social value should be achieved, and actually then put that bar in place that says that for central government and at arm's length bodies, so people like Department of Education, National Rail, Highways England, they had to take into account social value in all contracts post the 1st of January 2021. And those KPIs were around things like COVID-19 recovery, tackling economic inequality, climate change, equal opportunities, well-being, and also supply chain resilience. Now, you could be a bit cynical and feel that supply chain resilience one would just kind of leave it in because they wanted to get cyber security into there as well, but it's in there as part of the package. And that means that going forwards for those contracts, 10% of the consideration of contract award has to be a minimum of 10% has to be done on social value. What we then saw, as I say, we were going through the process of engaging with all of our customers to move them onto a new platform, and as a consequence, we were speaking to a lot of the main contractors. Was literally within weeks of it being out there in the public domain, people were like, okay, do you capture this information? Do you capture like social value information? Literally asking like specific things that related back to these KPIs. It became very clear that certainly at that main contractor level, who were largely a very significant percentage of their client base, essentially is the public purse. They were very, very concerned about this, and were trying to work out if they were going to have to respond to tenders and bids in this way, how were they actually going to be able to provide this information? That kicked off a piece of work that I'll get to in a second. Then shortly thereafter, we had the construction outsourcing playbook that was released towards the end of the year. Now, previous to that, there was also an outsourcing playbook that has since a new version of it was redone, I think, in May this year, and that's also now includes social value. But the construction outsourcing playbook very much has social value as a key theme throughout it. Once again, pointing back to PPN 620. But one of the key parts of that playbook is actually, it's on about page 79. There's like a table where it says, based on the kind of outcomes that they want to achieve, what the public sector and the private sector are expected to do. And I think it's the second point down. It makes it very, very clear to what they call the supply chain, essentially the private sector, is that they need to ensure that the principles and policies set out in the construction playbook flow down your supply chain. So it's not just about them delivering on social value KPIs, but the expectation is that they now have to be able to push that down through the supply chain and really measure that and be able to evidence that. Also, at the end of the year, we had the Transforming Public Procurement Green Paper. Now, you can all read those couple of sentences there. I'm not going to do that for you. It's very, very clear that the government is very much looking to use public procurement as a way to kind of drive a strategy of change that they want to make in and around the UK. And it's going to be very surprising if social value in what essentially becomes of this green paper. So it sounds like we're not even going to have a white paper. It's just going to become straight up legislation that will go through Parliament in the next session. Social value is clearly going to become quite a significant part to that, and I think it's going to be interesting to see if whether there's a change in a layering on top of PPN 620, which limits it, officially limits it to central government procurement, and actually starts to push that down onto also other contracting authorities like local authorities etc. So that's kind of like been the evolution of it, and I really feel like it's kind of snowballed quite significantly from the middle of last year. Now it's almost everybody we speak to, it's like almost their number one issue. So just next slide, please. So, how are we seeing that government policy move into practice? So one of the first things to understand about PPN 0620 is that the KPIs, a lot of them are actually project specific. So when you actually read it, it's almost something that's designed at the not really to be used that effectively in the procurement and sourcing phase. The KPIs are very specific to projects. So how many apprentices are going to be hired for this specific project? That in itself has created a bit of a challenge for certainly for private sector, because they need to be efficient in identifying who they can work with, so that they can actually deliver on and report on those KPIs. So we've very much seen that, and it was one of the things that came through loud and clear from our engagement with our customers, that there's become quite a strong requirement for social value data at the sourcing and invitation to tender stage. So we've been working with many of our top customers. So you're talking like 14 of the top 20 construction companies by turnover have been involved with us, basically establishing a social value scheme. It covers pretty much all of the areas in PPN 0620, but with one kind of key difference. So, and I think this is important for everyone on here to really understand, because it kind of identifies at least the near-term opportunity for people who actually really embrace social value as part of their story about what they tell about their business. So where they are project-specific KPIs, we've added questions in that allow people to almost evidence that they are able to do that, or they do that. Because what the big private sector firms are looking to do is they want to be able to identify suppliers as early in the process as possible that are actually going to be able to deliver on some of these KPIs. I mean, if they've got a requirement where they really do need people to be able to help them evidence, move towards net zero, it makes sense to engage with suppliers who, have at least the ability to report on it, have been doing their own reporting on their carbon emissions, rather than somebody who's like, I've got, we haven't done anything in this area. Now we're launching this scheme in 2021. It's free to all of our members, and of all of the things that we've ever done, we do a lot of cross collaboration with our main contractors. I've never seen the emphasis on the urgency to get it out and then for them to really support it, because they want maximum coverage of this data across their entire supply chain. Now, kind of further to what Richard was saying, we are starting to see this really come through now. So the Department of Education framework, the 7 billion framework, all the bids I think have gone in over the last couple of weeks. This has been one of the big pieces to come through throughout this year. And when you actually go through that, the framework documentation, there's a huge amount in there around the reporting that is expected on bidders in relation to social value. Different types of apprenticeships, how many employees throughout the supply chain are going to be within 30 miles of the projects. All of this type of data. We've been working quite closely with a number of our big contractors to help them prepare their bids to be able to evidence some of the data. And if this is the start of what's coming through, I think we're about to see quite a profound change in this area. So how does this have an implication for yourselves and your supply chain? Well, without a doubt, unless main contractors, they're already feeling the burden's the wrong word, but the overhead of being able to deliver on this, and obviously they have their own social value programs, but they are going to be looking to engage with firms that are able to evidence a strong social value story. It's the work required to build bids and tenders is already significant enough to be able to remove friction, to be able to identify people who've already got a great story. It's natural that there's going to be almost a preference to start to pull people in. Then the natural piece is that, when you start talking about, how much money is going into the local area, naturally, really, you're talking about multi-tier supply chain. All of this social value data over the next couple of years is going to have to push down through multi-tier supply chain. So not only you're going to have to evidence it, but you're going to have to start thinking about how do you evidence your supply chain, what they do, and actually bring that up to the surface. Because once again, I think that initially you're going to have an opportunity to have an advantage by yourselves having a good social value story. But if you really get on and start thinking about your own supply chain and how you can evidence that, I think that's going to give you an even greater advantage over everybody else. Eventually, this is going to become the bar. So the sooner you embrace that and get on with it, I think the better for your businesses.
Thanks, Rob. Grateful for that. Esther, can you hear me okay? And can I bring you in now? I think you might need to mute yourself. There you are. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was having a fight with Teams.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was qualifying that we were having the usual battle that one tends to have on these webinars, but you're here now, so thank you.
Yeah. So have you got my slides there?
Yeah, we're going to bring those up.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, social value in the supply chain is, it's really dry and it's difficult. And I think from our side, we specifically focus on how to build in social value around youth and employment, particularly, and ED&I metrics, equality, diversity, inclusion. The social value documentation obviously is, I don't know if anyone else has read it, but all 32 pages of it are quite dry. And what I wanted to do was talk through very briefly the practical ways that companies work with ourselves at Hundo.careers to specifically look at how to tackle ED&I metrics at the entry level and through the supply chain. Some of our clients build us in to their procurement and bids because, like yourselves, we're experts in this space and it's difficult to achieve. I was actually quite interested to see one of the comments on here from Stacey about a lack of focus, generic approach, and statistics that aren't actually beneficial, directly to the people kind of in the local area. So I wanted to touch on that. The things that we do, if you look at the documentation, MAC 1.1, creation of employment, theme 2 on new jobs and skills, and we also cover we also cover 2.2, 2.3, and the theme 4 around future of work and disability is also in our space. The way that we approach what we do, which is relevant to you, is looking at the first thing that businesses need to establish is where they're going wrong, or where their blind spots are, or where their unconscious bias may lie. And the way that we do that is a scorecard, which is where businesses sign up and they go through a process with our Gen Z audience, predominantly 14 to 24-year-olds, to look at why they're struggling to not just attract but also retain and advance. Once that process has happened, we're then able to recommend where you're going wrong, and a lot of it is stuff that you probably already know, some of the jargon, some of the language that just doesn't really mean anything to young people. From that, we build a launch pad, which is where young people can start to discover careers and start to discover what they need to be thinking about, and how they can start to engage. And for us, we cover the full life cycle of a young person's journey through employment, and this is where the supply chain is interesting, because at the moment what happens is everybody waits for young people to leave education, and then everybody starts to think about hiring. What we're saying is, if a young person is interacting through Hundo with you as an employer, you will have multiple data points, and that's where you can really start to track social value over time, because it's one thing, as you will all know, to get a young person a job, keeping them there, supporting them, being able to grow them through the business is much harder. And that's where we also help. So by providing kind of on-place ongoing support. So it means that Hundo candidates coming through, you can have worked with them on their work experience. That means that you're helping them make better educational choices about the jobs and roles that are coming on stream in an industry which, as far as I can tell, no expert, seems to be rapidly changing. So there's a kind of an issue of skills gaps and shortages on both sides. They can also do their T-levels, their apprenticeships, paid internships, part-time, full-time work, so that you are starting over time to really engage with this audience. In terms of metrics, I've put some of our stats on the side. The ones that are important, particularly from us, 50% come from disadvantaged socio-economic backgrounds. In simple terms, that means kids like me who grew up on free school meals in the main. 75% come from ethnically diverse backgrounds. And I think the metrics that matter, it's one thing to have to put in the bid and say what you're going to do, and having to then report back on it to support and strengthen your future procurement bids. The metrics around actual retention, 84% of our candidates are still employed 12 months later, and that's kind of where it matters. Attrition, as you will know, is a huge cost to your business, and it's a huge cost to a young person's life as well. And I think the stat that kind of sticks out for us the most is that 90% didn't believe they were even eligible for the employers that they now work for. And our process helps break down some of that. And as I said, a lot of our clients are now building us into their procurement bids, because this stuff isn't always easy. And what we're saying is, like, you know, it's complicated, but actually there's quite a simple process that is tangible and measurable, and that gives you the data and metrics that you need on the other side. And for us, our metrics are, you know, we want to support as many local people, young people, into work as we possibly can, because of things like COVID, because of things like Brexit. You know, young people are facing a particularly dreadful time, and in terms of social value from the government side, it's certainly a key area of focus. So I hope that gives you a sort of here's something practical that you can do, and hopefully, you know, help some young people get into work, but also support your bids as well.
Thank you, Esther. And Simon, before I hand over to you, and hopefully you can hear me okay, I think, you know, if I can just sum up that first half, I think there's some quite broad brushstrokes from Rob and myself, and hopefully we've sort of painted the picture about, you know, what we see is happening with social value, but also about, you know, those key things to start to think about as you evolve your understanding and as you evolve your journey. And then I think the piece from Esther there is that very practical detail of what that could look like. So thank you both so far. So Simon, can I hand over to you just to take us through some Q&A and see if we can shed a bit more light on today's session?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I would encourage you all to put questions either in the question area or in the chat. If there's no questions in the question area at the moment, so I assume that there's no questions. But in the chat, if you'd like to put some stuff into the chat, that would be great. A couple of the comments in the chat are quite interesting, in that there's a discussion about whether social value will be a tick box exercise, or whether it will actually deliver some real benefits on the ground. Rob, I know that you've been involved with a lot of the main contractors who are engaging with government. How real do you think this will be, or do you think it will end up to be a sort of paperwork exercise like a lot of the other compliance activities in the industry?
I mean, I don't think necessarily, obviously, everybody's doing it for completely altruistic purposes, because obviously they're trying to grow their businesses. But you know, when you talk to people, they absolutely see it as being a key differentiator for them as a business, and as a consequence, they are actually thinking about it properly. They want to be able to tell a really strong story in their bids and tenders, and to be able to, you know, to be able to evidence on that. So ultimately, you know, as a consequence of that, I think that you know, people definitely are not looking to use this as a tick box. They're 100% looking to use this to ultimately deliver real value into those areas. I mean, you only have to look at things like HS2. I mean, the HS2 the communication, the ethos that's coming out from that project centrally is absolutely setting the tone throughout the supply chain, down to the main contractors and further down as to what the expectations are. It's not just to be able to hit a few stats, it is to actually be able to deliver profound benefit to those areas.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's probably wrong to say it's a cross-party political consensus, but it's certainly, we're in a government that's said to be right or middle, right of centre, which is pushing social values. So one would assume that it's common across the political spectrum to try and achieve these outcomes. Esther, I don't know if you've observed how serious the politicians are at trying to achieve some of these objectives. Do you have any experience of that? That would be very interesting to understand.
Yeah, it's a hot topic. I think, as evidenced by obviously Treasury put 2 billion into the Kickstart scheme. We're obviously supporting some young people through that. I think it's the first time actually that there's a clear recognition that the problem isn't going to sort itself out, and that there needs to be a collaboration that is cross-party but also public-private. And I think that's where kind of the construction industry and a lot of those major industries have a real role to play, and I think I agree with you. It's kind of going. It's not. I don't think it's a nice to have anymore. I was on a Windmark Crown Commercial Service roundtable, and it was kind of a few years ago, and it was coming on stream then, but now it's almost like you've got to do this, sort of whether you want to or not. And I think there's an element of going, for us, it's kind of going, that's a pain point actually. If you think about the context of the whole bid that you have to do, and then this whole social value element. And I think certainly with employers, it's kind of trying to remove some of that pain point. It's definitely, and I don't think it's going away. I agree with on that. And
do you think there's a risk that there'll be a sort of social value washing, that greenwashing or sustainability washing that people do to try and make themselves look good without really the substance underneath? Do you think that's a risk?
I think it will happen, and I don't think that's a particular criticism or an indictment of the people who have been, shoved this on their desk with all the myriad other things that they have to do. I think that's, I watched it with, CSR, years ago. It's kind of it's a similar thing. I think what's different now that I've observed, obviously coming from a charity background, is that it's actually beneficial to businesses to do this. There is an actual bottom line benefit, and I would say 5 years ago you probably couldn't even have said that. So I think it's quite timely that the new legislation has come in this year, and I think that if businesses can start to see it as an opportunity.
I think that's a really important thing, that at this stage of engaging with the whole subject of social value, it seems to people who are inexperienced, it seems hard, it seems extra cost or more work. But in most of these things, the easy way is the hard way.
Yes.
Do the hard work now, and it gets very easy once you're aligned. And it's the lack of alignment that's the problem, not actually the cost or the other things. On that subject, though, Rob, do you think that, I know you at Construction Line, you're involved with the verification of other compliance type activities, like, for example, contractors' compliance with PAS 91 and these kind of things. Do you think this is going to take on more sort of formal, structured process, that people will be asked to fill out very detailed requirements in tender processes and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, but obviously we've got our social value scheme that is launching. I think Joe just asked a question about a little bit more about it. So it's just essentially a question set, as I said, completely free to all of our members, whether they're on a free level or a paid level. So the idea is we didn't want to have any friction to it. So if people wanted to invite other companies that maybe aren't naturally in the construction sector, just for them to be able to fill out that information, then that's fine for them to do so. This is
like a social value calling card almost. It just gives your credentials as well. Okay.
Yeah, and the idea is that the next iteration that the contractors want us to actually take is to actually build a maturity index on top. So, based on how people respond to actually have, whether, firms fully embraced it or whether they're just at the very start of that journey, and to be able to reflect that into the system so that they can use it as part of the sourcing process. But I think obviously what we're doing is that PQQ sourcing phase, and then I think the idea is that they can start to bring people through, and at the invitation to tenders, they're going to have to be able to evidence in much more detail in relation to the specific project. And then as you go through to the next phase, which is the actual delivery of the project, there are obviously there's things like the social value portal where you can put KPIs that people can report. I know people like Balfour Beatty, they have their own internal system for the reporting of those metrics as well. But they, very much when you talk to certainly the people like the Balfour Beatties and Kiers of this world, the people who are working on this are extremely passionate about it. They've clearly invested a lot of money into the people, and their vision is to be able to report on this throughout the entire life cycle of every project, for them to be able to start at the beginning and say, this is what our funnel of potential suppliers look like, all the way through to the project closing, to be able to evidence what social value was actually delivered as a result of that investment.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Andrew in the chat answered a very good question, and Stacey's answer is good. In a way, this is about creating, through the project process, creating legacy, which you leave behind, which is positive rather than negative. Esther, it's very interesting to think about your business in this, because if you're dealing with young people, oftentimes you're just trying to get them, because the gap between school and that first step on the ladder, to us old folk, it's a long past in the distance, and it seems like a very small step. But I remember when I was 16, that step is extremely tall. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the legacy that that social value projects create for people and individuals, young people in particular. And that would be very interesting, and it responds to the question that's come in the chat. Yeah,
it's a good question. I think that we start, as I said earlier, we start much younger, so a business can build a relationship with a cohort of young people, well in advance, so that there is an element of knowing what to expect. We are obviously, with our candidates, we support them pre-interview, post, and then with check-ins, in the kind of first week, third month, sixth month. So we're able to, we kind of see ourselves, and they perceive us as an ally, both to them and to the employer, because at a strategic level, everyone knows it's a good thing to do, but it's the guys on the floor who've got to deal with, this person with this coming in, and it's kind of going. So I think there is it's the more sort of, it's a much more, what's the word I'm looking for, end-to-end process. It's not just a case of like, right, you're now getting a job and then you go off and do that. So I think, and in terms of legacy, the reason that young people kind of port back to us, it means that even with Kickstart, it's a good example, those are 6-month placements. Many of them come to an end, but what it's giving them is an added bonus of experience, 6 months experience, and then we can help find them other jobs. And I do think within the sector, you would be able, as projects come to an end, if you have good people that you can't keep, the idea that, we can help facilitate and as an industry can help to move those young people through so that they're growing, then I think that's how you can measure and track kind of that type of social value. And how do you find your candidates? Do they come to you, or do you reach out to schools and other places? Is that how you do it? Yeah, so we actively work at the moment in terms of our network with about 410,000 young people. As a direct example, we did some work with Havering College, construction focused, and it's some simple things. We had 2 lads who got work experience, but they couldn't afford the train fare. So there are some simple metrics that you can do, and so I've just noticed Joe's question about how do we target next generation, which is the same thing. So we actively work with kind of best-in-class education training providers, charity, third sector. It's a very, very fragmented space with a lot of great work going on, but it's quite hard for employers to interact. So that's kind of the point of Hundo, is that we can kind of marry those 2 worlds, do proper matching, not with AI, not with sort of like psychometric tests, with actual, there is no value. To Stacey's point earlier, there is no value in tick box ED&I. It doesn't work. Young people don't stay, and then the business has a bad time of it, and then everybody's put off from doing it in the future. So it's much more targeted by looking at what the roles are, what the business is looking to achieve, and then we kind of reverse engineer that back in terms of finding the right candidates from the right places. We do work with ex-offenders, to answer Joe's question, and on the disability side, there's 1.3 million young people with SEN and physical disabilities, of which 7% are in paid work and 80% can work. Particularly when Rob was talking about the cybersecurity bit that's been shoehorned in, young people with autism and Asperger's are actually high value candidates, and I think it's starting to. I think both sides. I think construction and young people have got a kind of a brand problem, and I think in terms of like bringing them together and starting to reframe that actually this is a great industry to work in. I think that's where you start to get real legacy coming through.
Very interesting. In the Green Paper, the government proposed to change, I think as Rob and maybe Richard referred to, change the assessment of public contract awards from, to use the jargon, MEET to MAT. So most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender. And I think there's a real effort to try and step away from this spreadsheet. You fill everything out, look at the pounds at the bottom and just pick the lowest number, because of the, obviously that has some advantages to get value for money, but the quantification of indirect value is actually a very hard thing to do. So I noticed that in the Googling around social value, people are trying to convert social value into pounds so that you can capture this indirect value in a real number, and that can be taken into account. So that seems like a really interesting development, in particular if the government and local authorities start to actually have a pounds value, so that sales teams in our construction friends on the line here watching, sales teams will have to be fully aware of what their organisation's social contribution is, social value contribution is in the sales process. So they're almost the last people you think of being, you do think of this starting in compliance. Well, we've got to fill out these extra forms, but really it's now getting into the sales DNA and explaining that if we were to win this project, we would actually do it in this way, and that would generate these indirect benefits because of the way we operate our company, and that's very interesting. Maybe Richard, you could give us a short window on, I know you introduced Matrix at the very beginning, but explain what Matrix do in terms of their business model, and in particular some of the things that we think about in terms of social value in the helping our clients to monitor and manage the recruitment of contingent labour and maybe the social makeup of those people.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
brilliant. So I think, well, if I just preface that by saying, and it's just really interesting listening to the debate, this almost seems to be, a 25-year journey. If you go back to sort of CSR and, some of the points that you were making, Esther, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And, again, I think for me, it's absolutely critical to sort of frame that, because I think we've all been doing some of this stuff, and the point I guess I was trying to make in my sort of summary is you've really got to understand what it is. And I think if you look at what we do here, Simon, I think for me there's sort of three elements which just sort of stand out. So the first things first is as a business, if you look at our sort of model, we are about contingency and temporary recruitment. We manage those supply chains. We work with big organisations that have complex needs, including a lot of customers direct within the public sector, so local government as an example. So we have a natural bias towards employability issues, back to work issues, and we can bring that skill not only from ourselves but also from our supply chain. And I think one of the huge learns, and this is the work that Siobhan's been doing, is it's trying to marry up that core piece. So if I go back to the point I was making about you have to understand what you do and what you can bring to the party, I think that one for us has been very obvious. And then from there is then how do we bring that not only directly but also from our supply chain. I think the second point then is, as you get to have this discussion with the customers, their priorities may be different. And we did a really interesting piece of work, and that's me using the royal we, I hasten to add. But we did a really interesting piece of work with Westminster where they said, look, actually, our priority is about environmental. So the support they wanted actually wasn't about employability, and it wasn't about bringing people back into the workplace. So again, that touch of agility, and I think the debate that sort of Siobhan had is could we do that and still deliver that sort of sensibly. And then I think the third element is just understanding the drivers, and it goes back to those themes, and I think particularly the theme of localism. And increasingly we're getting asked about, can you bring in businesses in your supply chain who are local, who are niche, who are startups, who are possibly even social enterprises. And I think we're just going to see more and more and more of that. So look, I hope that's a reflection, but I think we're on the journey, we're not at the destination, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, it's quite clear from this discussion and the answers we've had that the public sector, politicians and the instruments of government, the green paper turning into legislation, that's the PPN, that train has now left. And you can see the impact of that over the next 6 months for sure. The open question is what's going to happen in the private sector, and that maybe is a question for you, Rob. You talked about the multi-tier supply chain, which is a kind of complicated concept, I guess. But are you saying that someone who contracts with a public authority might actually then have to ensure that social value is happening throughout the chain, and how would that work?
Yeah, so well, HS2 are one of the biggest pushers of this, certainly on us as a business. We've talked about how it can be achieved, and in speaking with some of the HS2 JVs, when we've kind of broached that we have a proof of concept in place, their eyes light up and it's like, what? So we'd be able to actually see, where employees are actually coming from, even if they're subcontracted through the supply chain. Like, yeah, and that because the reality is, the way that it's worked until now is people say, oh yeah, we're working with these firms and this is where they're based, but then nobody ever had the ability to go down to the next detail of actually they subcontracted these people, and didn't actually have visibility of where actually the investment is really going. The industry, certainly the firms that we've been working with, like I say, HS2, JVs, and a number of the other main contractors, they really want to have the ability to kind of have a project set up, for example, in our system, and then when they subcontract out to other firms, they would ask them to set up a project which would be linked to that project, and ultimately go down the tiers, so that you actually get true visibility of actually where is the actual flow of investment going. If we're just talking about cash, where is the flow of investment going? But also things like, okay, actually, if we come down here, how many of these firms have got wellness programs for staff? How many of these programs are actually investing in towards net zero? How many of these firms have actually got modern slavery policies and actually then push them down onto their own supply chain? I think there's been this kind of view that multi-tier supply chain is just too difficult to do, but I think now with the way that the technology platforms available, the things that are being done in other industries, I don't think we're too far away from actually multi-tier supply chain becoming a real thing that actually starts to really pull together the full layers of a project delivery.
Yeah, very true. I'm going to hand back to you in a minute, Richard. Just a few sort of closing thoughts. I was speaking to a main board director of one of the main contractors this morning, and we were discussing social value in its sort of general sense. And one of the things that struck me, he said, look, they're a tier 1 contractor, extremely large company, and they said, look, when we're taking public money, the public have a right to understand how it's spent. You know, it's not like a magic pot of money that's come from nowhere. It's come from taxes, both on businesses and individuals, and the accountability that the public require through the government, the collecting of those taxes, is that we explain how that money is being spent. And in the past, that was just on getting value for money in its narrowest sense. But now there's a realisation that the broader sense should be used to be accountable for how that public money is spent. And that's got to include this other social value dimension. And that was from a tier 1 main board director. So I think the message has definitely got home. And I think it's very hard for people to look at this as an administrative exercise. It's not our money, it's the government's money, which they've taxed voters, workers, companies with. And if we're going to benefit from that through our businesses, from getting contracts from that, we owe it to the people who are paying, the voters, to be accountable for it. And as part of social policy, generating good social value seems a very sensible outcome to head for. So very, very interesting discussion. Great answers, guys. Back to you, Richard.
Lovely. Okay. Well, look, we are almost there. We've got a minute left, so I'll just try and draw together. We phrased the introduction for this webinar was social value in the construction sector. What's next? I don't think that question is answerable in an hour session, but hopefully we shed a bit more light and create some food for thought. And I hope you found this session beneficial, and thanks all for sharing your lunch hour. I'd echo Simon's point. Thank you for your contributions, and I'd particularly like to thank obviously Esther and Rob and Simon, for sharing their thoughts. So thank you very much for that, guys. There will be a recording of this event made available, so if you would like to have another listen in, or indeed pass on to your colleagues, I'll circulate that in the next few days. And if anyone has any specific comments, please do pick up with me directly, and I'll pick those up and take those forward. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day, and once again, goodbye from the panel. And Esther, I'm delighted we got you in the end.
Eventually.
Lovely. Thanks once again.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.